think the US and the UK have a lot to learn from each other. I think there are some very interesting parallels between, the most obvious ones being between, let's say, charter schools and free schools, between charter management chains and academy chains. But we also share many of the challenges. For example, the underachievement of black and ethnic minority students within the system, issues around homeschooling, issues about faith schooling, the freedoms that it brings, but also the concerns. We've seen some of them recently in Birmingham. So I think there are lessons to be learned in the United States from the UK experience, and certainly lessons to be learned in the UK from the US experience.
What we wanted to do with this report with our partners in the US was look at what's working well in terms of leadership and what we ought to be building on for the future.
Leadership in England is incredibly important because of that autonomy that schools have. The quality of leadership has a huge impact on the quality of outcomes for children. So at all levels, whether that's head teachers, executive heads, middle leaders, heads of department, we need really great leadership if our schools are going to thrive. And a lot of effort has gone in over the last 10 or 15 years to the development of leaders to make sure that we've got a really good supply of people, and also that we've got a pipeline coming through that's going to take the system forward.
School leadership is probably the second most important factor in a school becoming effective. After the quality of instruction in the classroom, it's probably school leadership.
Leadership development provision in the UK has largely been overseen over the past decade by the National College. The National College took a view over the past 10 years about what leadership development should look like nationally. So it thought very much about the provision of programmes at all levels of leadership. And in the UK we have leadership provision at principal, head teacher level, at senior leadership level and at middle leadership level as well. They also looked at school business managers, governors, so there was a real oversight of national provision. And the way that that national provision broke down was that it was seen as both the national programmes which worked across all schools, but there were also certain programmes which focused on high potential leaders working in the most challenging schools. So there was a real focus from the National College on both deprivation but also on the highest potential leaders working in those schools.
What's been interesting about the development of the NPQH is when I applied for it, it was regarded nationally as an absolute requirement for headship. It was like a driving licence. You weren't going to be getting a headship unless you had the NPQH. And I think it had been through a couple of iterations up until that point. For the 2 or 3 years that I was working on it, that was still very much a requirement. And then in the last couple of years, through whether it's due to the academies movement or changes in priorities at the leadership centre, it's not now regarded as something that is critical. And I think that's a pity to one extent, because it suggests that you don't need a certain level of experience and qualification to be able to move into headship, and that anybody can do it. But at the same time, I think it recognises that being a head is not like learning to drive. You can't just have a certain number of skills that you've got that immediately equates you to being a head.
It's been very effective, the extent to which the National College engaged with the practitioner community and also with the academic community. I think it led to what we might call a cross-fertilisation of ideas. The United States, of course, being a huge country, I'm not sure the extent to which cross-fertilisation is easy, but it has certainly been very beneficial in the UK, and this has been largely facilitated by a national college of some sort.
So we've moved away here from a National College for School Leadership that delivered leadership training across the country to a system of more local licensees and local provision, and that decentralisation, I think, has allowed leadership development to be much more contextualised to the needs of individual schools and communities. So what leaders need to do in, say, a global city like London is very different from what leaders need to do if you go out to a small coastal town that's very much white working class. And having that decentralised system enables those differences to be taken into account. The downside is that it's harder when people move across from one area to another to make sure that there's a consistency. But I think that's something that a lot of organisations are getting together to try and solve.
I think one of the challenges we have now is about how we go from a system where everything was given to school leaders before to an approach now where school leaders have to deliver more for themselves and for each other. So we've seen a move away from centrally commissioned programmes to a system now where teaching schools are meant to design and deliver more of their programmes. So there's more of an onus on them to cater for leadership development and initial teacher training within their particular geographical areas. I think that there's a challenge around capacity, because I think there is some variation in the quality of teaching schools at the moment. One of the strengths, though, is that the system has enabled us to make that shift and that there is a good level of capacity at the moment to make that move.
Personally, I'm slightly concerned about the UK's government shift away from teacher training in universities. Certainly, there should be no question of teachers being trained without schools, but the extent to which trainees, and don't forget the next generation of curriculum leaders and senior leaders and head teachers are going to come from this cohort at some stage. I think it's a mistake to de-theorise and to decouple the educational leadership profession from the people working at the cutting edge of research into how it's done.
I think the days when you expected school to develop you as a teacher or anything actually are gone, pretty much. And that also gone are the days, really, when you get on a train and tootle off to London to do a £600 course. I think by and large, those days are gone too, and that really development of any sort isn't something that is done to you, it's done by you. So you can look for opportunities for development in lots of sectors, so in terms of pedagogy or learning, teaching, or in terms of leadership, and you can look and make those opportunities for yourself. So be it, making links with other schools or practitioners that you're interested in and developing a practice through shared blogging or doing hangouts or something like that, which I've been doing, which is really helpful.
We're very lucky in the UK that we have 3 levels of leadership that get a real focus and a consistent focus across our system. So head teachers are undoubtedly really critical. We've had a big drive to increase the number of head teachers in our system through programs like Future Leaders, which has really been targeting high potential leaders, fast-tracking them to headship positions and increasingly focusing on how we get them into the areas that need them most. As part of that progression, we've also been developing senior leaders. So those are our deputy heads, our vice principals, who are going to be the ones that play that future headship role. But we've also had a big focus on middle leadership. So that would typically be your heads of department, your heads of year, or people leading in whole school areas. So they're similar to the teacher leader role that you might have in the US. And what we've been really lucky about is that there's been significant investment in that tier of leadership. Middle leaders typically are responsible for the quality of teaching within their departments. So particularly if they're leading big areas like English or maths or science, some of those core subjects, they have a really, really important role within the school. They're highly accountable and highly autonomous for their areas of responsibility.
The theoreticians and the academics have conceptualized leadership in a way that forces practitioners to assume that schools are naturally orderly places. But practitioners would suggest to you that the opposite is the case. Schools are naturally chaotic places. So I feel that the academic community is forcing an unrealistic model on practitioners that's making it difficult for them to theorize and be properly reflective of their own practice. I think the theory is flawed, not the practice.
Over the last 10 years, we've typically seen a lot of leadership development provision, and one of the changes that we are now seeing as a result of more academy groups, federations, teaching school alliances is the emergence of the executive head teacher role. Now, what's unique about the executive head teacher role is that it is about leading across a group of schools. And this might be leading across a number of secondary schools, but it could be leading secondary and primary schools in the same area and the same alliance. Those executive head teachers have accountability for the results of that group of schools.
I am a member of the senior management team, which puts me as an assistant head at the bottom of the senior level of leadership. The structure of the school is that we do have the headmaster at the top. There are 2 deputies, one looks after all of the academic side of the school and one looks at the pastoral side of the school, and then underneath that there is a tier that I'm a part of, so I look after the co-curriculum. There is a member of staff who is exclusively there to look after the staff, and so he's in charge of all CPD and any staff issues that occur.
There are lots of other leadership positions that you can take on quite early on in your career, which I found really beneficial, to be able to take on a head of netball position after a year of teaching, and then I got a head of house position, which again gives you that experience and exposure quite early on.
The way that the leadership works is that you take on responsibility. As Jess said, you're paid for that, or you're given time remission to do that. And then there's always somebody to go and ask that question of. So everybody has their specific thing that they are held responsible for, and then they will be accountable to somebody. So the whole structure is very hierarchical, and you can see a very distinct line of responsibility that always ends with the headmaster.
I think having a very clear structure makes it's aspirational, because it gives colleagues that coming in at the very beginning of their career, it allows them to see the opportunities where they can go to further on in their career. So it's not just heads of department and heads of faculty. Within those departments and faculties, there's also other areas of promotion and other areas of responsibility that you can have. So it's scaffolded from very early on. So we may get NQTs, newly qualified teachers who've come into the profession and have been teaching just for a year. And if they're exceptionally strong, we will encourage them to apply for an additional role of responsibility. So they may not be ready to be a head of department, but they're given a scaffold into having a small, another responsibility, which starts to give them the tools to become a head of department or a head of faculty or a director of a particular area, and so on.
I mean, at the moment I'm 43 years old and an assistant head teacher, and there are people a lot younger than me as an assistant head. But I feel for me that was right. You know, it's a good time to be here now, and you know, I probably will look to progress further. But it's being allowed to do it kind of in your own time and having that opportunity to develop, you know, over quite a long time, so you feel confident before you move on to the next step.
When I first walked through the door on my first day of teaching, I had no thought process about wanting ever to be on a senior leadership team. In fact, looking at head teachers and deputy head teachers was a bit of a scary process. But probably after about 2 years, I was hungry for more, and I wanted to be a head of department. I then, following a leading from the middle course, had the aspiration and confidence to go and become a head of faculty, where I was responsible for overseeing more colleagues and responsible for lots of students attaining great outcomes in their subject areas.
So in terms of my own work-life balance, it has kind of reassured me that I don't have to be the person running around doing everything, and in fact I'm disempowering people by doing that. It's more about how I can facilitate other people to grow as leaders. And that's helped me manage my day a lot more effectively, but also makes me feel more sort of positive about the impact I've had.
I think one of the big shifts we've seen in the UK has been that middle leaders have real accountability now for their results, and you hear a lot of head teachers saying that their heads of English and heads of maths, because of our accountability system, are actually more important than senior leaders in their schools. And I think that for middle leadership or teacher leadership to really move forward in the US, there needs to be a real recognition not only of its importance, but an empowerment of teacher leaders to have both the line management responsibility and the accountability for the results of pupils, so they can really see the direct impact of the changes that they're making. The role of teaching schools, as started by the National College, was to deliver local leadership development and initial teacher training so that schools could actually lead those areas for themselves. And they started with an initial cohort of 100 and the aspiration was that by the end of this Parliament, so by 2015, there would be 500 teaching schools distributed right the way across our system, leading leadership development and initial teacher training in their local areas. And typically teaching schools were formed as part of an alliance with a lead school and then a local group of primary and secondary schools who would lead that leadership development within their particular local area. So far we've got about 400 teaching schools and they're growing fast, and a lot of what's allowed them to grow has been the previous National Leader of Education systems that have underpinned them, so that you had school leaders who were leading outside of their schools really kind of focusing that in a more formalised way through their teaching school alliance.
So as a teaching school, I mean, we're in an alliance with 2 other schools. So what it means is that you have responsibility to take on key priorities for the sort of school network. So that will include initial teacher training. So we run something called School Direct, which is where we recruit directly trainees, and we provide a training for those in coordination with a higher education provider. We also are responsible for running the kind of courses we've talked about, so middle leadership programmes. The biggest piece of work that we're doing at the moment is school-to-school support. So that means where there are other schools that don't have the capacity for these kind of leadership models, either because they're small or because they're relatively new or for whatever reason they're in a vulnerable position, we go in and support. And that's, again, in a bespoke way. We go in, review the situation, and then put an action plan together. So at the moment, myself and one colleague are working at another school 1 day a week to help them develop teaching and learning and CPD programmes.
The legacy of regional variation of national leaders of education has kind of come through in the teaching school system. So we see pockets of the country, particularly in rural and coastal areas, where there are particular gaps in teaching school provision. And I think one of the things we really need to think about is how we ensure that we get that provision in those areas.
When I trained to teach, I followed a postgraduate certificate of education, which is a university-based 1-year training programme, whereby you learn a lot of theory around pedagogy and classroom practice, and then you have 2 extended placements in 2 local schools. So the benefit of that system was that I was very secure around the theory and research to do with teaching and learning. But you didn't really have a sense of belonging to a school because you were put in any old school. And I think what we now have is a system where there's more choice about routes into teaching. So that still exists, and it probably remains the most popular, probably because it's the most well known. But now we have something called School Direct as well, which we're heavily involved in. And that means teaching schools or successful schools can directly recruit people to train.
So the aspiration, I think, in the long term is that you won't need nationally or centrally commissioned leadership programmes. The aspiration is that teaching schools will take on the bulk of that delivery for the system.
Okay, can I see hands, please? The final point in the end is that leadership is about getting people at a school level to be empowered to do what they think is right for children. not because they're told to, but because it's what they believe. And any system of developing leaders has to have that at its heart. It has to have the opportunity and the intent to really unleash innovation and potential across the whole system. And that's a risky thing to do, because as well as successes, there'll be failures, but ultimately it's that power of leadership that can transform a whole system far better than central government diktat.